Our first speaker today is Father Cristian Sylva. Father Cristian Sylva has served for 4 years as an assistant priest at St. George Orthodox Cathedral for the Archdiocese of Santiago and all Chile under the Omophorion of His Eminence Sergio. Previously, he served as a deacon for 12 years in the same cathedral. He graduated with the M.Div from Antiochian House of Studies in 2024 and will soon begin his PhD studies in Orthodox theology. Father Cristian, together with his wife, Andrea, has been married for 28 years and they have 3 children. The title of his presentation is Theosis in the Patristic Mind, Faith, Reason, and Father Romanides' Neo-Patristic Defense of Orthodoxy. Father Cristian.
Thank you very much. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. First of all, I'm very humbled to be part of today's session as a presenter among such great presenters. My presentation today is related to theosis in the patristic mind, focused on the neo-patristic defense of orthodoxy based on the teachings of Father John Romanides. These are the main topics that we will deep dive today regarding theosis in the patristic mind. The doctrine of theosis or deification is the core of the Orthodox theology, understood as the ultimate purpose of human existence. Real union with God as expressed in the Gospel of John, that they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. Theosis is rooted in the patristic tradition of the Church and has been rearticulated in the modern times by Father Johannes Romanides, who preserved the spirits of early fathers while expressing in the contemporary framework. The Church is the space where theosis is lived and transmitted. Apostolic succession represents not merely institutional continuity, but the ongoing experience of divine grace and true apostolicity is found in those who participate in this transformation. Father Romanides emphasizes that authentic theology arises from the direct experience of God, especially through illumination and deification, marking a clear contrast with the Western theology, which tends to prioritize reason over experience. Therefore, knowledge of God is not attained through logic or rational arguments, but through inner purification and transformation which enable true participation in divine life. Father Johannes Romanides presents Christian theology not as an speculative or philosophical discipline, but as an empirical science grounded in the experience of God. He seeks to recover the patristic tradition, emphasizing that the Church Fathers were not abstract thinkers, but spiritual physicians who described real states of human transformation, thereby rejecting the rationalist tendencies of Western theology. Within this framework, the doctrine of theosis is understood as being built upon 2 fundamental pillars: the living tradition of the Holy Fathers and Romanides' modern systematization, which redefines Orthodox theology in a therapeutic science aimed at healing and transformation of the human person. Father Romanides redefined theology as an experiential and therapeutic science rooted in the Fathers and centered on the healing of the human being through theosis. Eastern Christian theology teaches that humanity was created for a transcendent purpose, participation in the divine life, or theosis, as expressed by St. Athanasius of Alexandria. This establishes theosis as the foundation of both creation and salvation. Father Romanides interprets this theosis not as a metaphor, but as an ontological reality, where the human being is called to real transformation through grace, going beyond moral or juridical understandings of salvation. For Father Romanides, authentic theology arises from lived spiritual experience, purification, illumination of the nous, and participation in the divine glory, making experience the criterion of theological truth rather than abstract reasoning. He further emphasizes that the authority of the Church Fathers is grounded in their direct experience of God, meaning that tradition is not merely textual transmission, but a living continuity of spiritual experience. Father Ioannis Romanides argues that the Church Fathers shared a profound unity that transcends historical and linguistic differences, grounded in a common experience of purification, illumination, and deification. Key fathers like St. Athanasius of Alexandria, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Gregory of Palamas, and St. Maximus the Confessor agree that the salvation is an ontological transformation of the human being. The nous is not a rational intellect, but a faculty of direct spiritual perception, originally oriented toward God and capable of continuous communion, becoming simple, luminous, and full of love when united with Him, as St. Maximus said. Theosis is the participation in God's uncreated glory, experience in divine light, as the Hesychast tradition said, representing a real communion with God while preserving the distinction between divine and human essence. The patristic tradition represents salvation as the transformation of the human being through the restoration of the nous and participation in God's uncreated life. Gregory of Palamas distinguishes between God's essence, which is inaccessible, and energies, which are participable. Father Ioannis Romanides adopts this to define theosis as participation in the divine energies. Theosis is a fundamental element of the holy tradition and the purpose of the human creation, understood as the restoration of and elevation of humanity. Therefore, it is not an innovation, but a core expression of patristic anthropology. The fathers, especially St. Maximus the Confessor and St. Gregory Palamas, interpret sin as the darkening of the nous, a spiritual illness that disrupts knowledge of God through passions, mental dispersion, and loss of illumination, rather than a legal fault. In this framework, theosis is the participation in divine life by grace without confusion of natures. As St. Maximus explains, the human being becomes like God by grace while preserving the distinction of essence. This framework, sorry, I was. Okay. This framework preserves the ontological distinction between creator and creature, while affirming the real possibility of communion with God. The fall is understood as the darkening and deviation of the nous, the spiritual faculty oriented toward God, as St. Maximus Confessor explains. Humanity turns away from God and becomes dispersed in created realities. The darkened nous loses its capacity for contemplation and becomes spiritually degraded. For Father Ioannis Romanides, this redefines sin as a spiritual illness of the nous, rather than a legal transgression. This fallen condition is marked by fragmentation and dispersion, as human energy is misdirected toward the sensible world instead of God. Therefore, the fall is not a juridical fault, but an interior disorder, shifting the understanding of salvation from guilt to healing, a therapeutic perspective later fully developed by Father John Romanides. The patristic tradition presents theosis as a structured and dynamic path of transformation through three stages: purification, illumination, and deification, where human effort cooperates with divine grace, although theosis itself is ultimately a gift from God. This spiritual process reaches its highest expression in the experience of the uncreated life, as taught by St. Gregory Palamas, who explains that the vision of God becomes possible through purification and participation in divine energy. Theosis is therefore not an abstract or static condition, but a real continuous experience of grace, involving infinite growth in communion with God and perspective emphasized by Gregory of Nyssa and Father Ioannis Romanides. The fathers distinguish between intellectual and experiential knowledge of God, affirming that true theologian is not merely one who knows doctrines, but one who has personally experienced God, as stated by St. Gregory Palamas. Father Romanides reinforces that theology and theosis cannot be attained through rational speculation, but through purification of the heart and direct participation in divine grace, since the created intellect cannot fully comprehend the uncreated God. As a result, theology is understood not as a philosophical system, but as an existential and mystical reality that must be lived rather than merely conceptualized. Father Ioannis Romanides redefines Orthodox theology as an empirical science grounded in spiritual experience, particularly through purification, illumination, and theosis. In this framework, apostolic tradition is not merely the transmission of doctrines or the continuation of but the continuation of a therapeutic method through which the Church seeks to heal the human person and restore communion with God. Father Romanides strongly critiques Western theology, especially scholasticism, for separating theology from spiritual experience and reducing the knowledge of God to philosophical and traditional categories influenced by figures such as Augustine of Hippo or Thomas Aquinas. He rejects the idea that God can be known through natural reason alone and criticizes the juridical interpretation of salvation, arguing that these approaches distort human nature and the work of Christ. In contrast, Father Romanides presents Orthodox theology as an integrated vision of experience, healing, and transformation, where theological truth is verified through ascetic practice and inner spiritual change. He further emphasizes that patristic tradition is a living continuity of spiritual experience, not simply a collection of texts. Therefore, theology cannot be separated from spiritual life. An authentic knowledge of God requires participation in the same experience lived by the fathers. Knowledge of God is attained through the purification of the heart rather than intellectual reasoning, affirming the primacy of the experience over theory and making communion with God accessible to all who live according to the gospel. Ultimately, Father Romanides reinterprets the patristic tradition as a therapeutic and experiential framework, understanding theology as a healing science aimed at restoring the human being. Father Ioannis Romanides develops a vision consistent with the patristic understanding of sin as illness and salvation as healing, presenting the Church as a therapeutic space for restoration of the human person. Drawing from the teaching of St. John Chrysostom, who described the Church as a hospital, not a court, Father Romanides explains that sin is a spiritual illness. The priest acts as a physician through Christ. The sacraments function as a therapeutic means. However, their effectiveness depends on the believer's spiritual disposition and participation in an inner process of transformation. This therapeutic vision also extends to monastic life, which Father Romanides describes as a kind of schools of medicines, where the human being is trained in healing and deification. A central element in his theology is the nous, understood as the spiritual faculty that must be purified in order to restore communion with God. Father Romanides identifies the darkening of the nous as the fundamental human problem and directs all spiritual life toward its healing. As a result, Christian life is reinterpreted as a process of interior restoration where divine grace and human effort cooperate together in the healing and transformation of the person. Father Ioannis Romanides does not present a rupture with the patristic tradition, but a faithful reinterpretation that preserves doctrinal continuity while demonstrating the timeless relevance of the Holy Fathers in the modern world. Father Romanides distinguishes between theology that adapts itself to the contemporary trends and patristic theology, which remains unchanging while continually offering answers to modern challenges through eternal truth. A major contribution of his thought is the integration of multiple dimensions of Christian life, from the theological perspective to doctrine of theosis, spiritual to ascetic life, sacramental to participation in divine grace, pastoral to the church as a therapeutic space. This reflects the holistic Orthodox vision, where theory and practice are inseparable. Father Romanides also emphasizes that the sacraments do not function automatically, but require the believer's active spiritual disposition and participation in the therapeutic process of healing and transformation. Ultimately, his theology succeeds in uniting doctrine, spiritually, sacramental life, and praxis into a coherent and integrated vision of Christian life. This theological perspective presents a coherent and solid interpretation of Orthodox theology distinguished by its fidelity to the patristic tradition. Its clear spiritual structure, the integration of Father Ioannis Romanides' thought, and its understanding of salvation as a therapeutic process of healing and transformation. At the same time, its limited dialogue with other theological traditions restricts its ecumenical scope. However, this also highlights Romanides' role as a defender and guardian of the Orthodox faith, in continuity with the mission of the Holy Fathers. The doctrine of Theosis remains the central foundation of Orthodox theology, understood as the complete transformation of the human person through participation in divine life. Through the teaching of the Holy Fathers and the reinterpretation of Father Ioannis Romanides, salvation is presented not merely as forgiveness, but as healing, purification, illumination, and communion with God through divine grace. In this vision, theology is no longer an abstract intellect system but a living and experiential reality in which the nous is restored and directed toward God. Father Romanides redefines theology as an empirical and therapeutic science, moving away from the rationalistic and juridical models and returning to the patristic understanding of spiritual life, of transformation and healing. Ultimately, through knowledge of God is attained not through reasoning alone, but through existential participation in divine grace, leading humanity toward its ultimate vocation, union with God.